He won the Iron Cross and the Légion d'honneur. But he was a British officer. In fact, he was a very influential Victorian era general who served in almost every major war of the late Victorian era. But who was he? Today I'm going to tell you more about the British general you really should know about.
Edward VII said of him that Brackenbury was the man who pulled the army out of the hole in South Africa.
That's Chris Brice. He's written this excellent book about today's fascinating subject, General Sir Henry Brackenbury. Stay tuned to find out all about this interesting man, how he cut his teeth during the Indian Mutiny, why he bizarrely faked a lisp, and then learn how he changed the intelligence gathering machinery of the British War Office and also improved the logistics supply chain. These are really important subjects and we're going to get into those.
Lord Wolseley said of him, he's not one of, but he is the cleverest man in the British Army.
That's a hell of a statement, isn't it? So let's not dwell on his early life because I want to get straight into the action. Suffice it to say, he was the youngest son of a youngest son from a minor Lincolnshire landowning family. Not rich, but certainly not poor. But having said that, he did manage to attend Eton, yes, the same place the princes in the British royal family still go to now. But then after school, he surprisingly moved to Canada and worked in Quebec. It was only later on in 1856, at the age of 19, old for that time, he joined the British Army.
He's commissioned in April 56. Well, by August 56, he's already acting as the adjutant for the Royal Artillery in the Western District of the United Kingdom. Which is important because you've got the fortresses like Plymouth, the naval fortresses like Plymouth, you've also got Falmouth as well, I suppose. There's a lot of important areas in there, so it's a fairly key job. And actually this leads on, and there's a funny little story that goes on to how he ends up in the Indian Mutiny in fighting the suppression, because he volunteers for service there. And because he's doing such a good job as adjutant, his commanding officer says, no, we can't spare you, and refuses to let him go to India. And Brackenbury doesn't leave it there. Rather than sort of accept that, he gets his uncle, Sir Edward, working on trying to get him there. And Sir Edward's former Peninsular War buddy is the Adjutant General of Artillery, Sir Hugh Ross. And basically this story goes that Sir Edward asks Sir Hugh, can he get him on the boat to India, basically. And Sir Hugh asks, well, how old is the lad? And Sir Edward's, his uncle, just says, oh, he's only 19. And Sir Hugh says, only 19, and they say he can't be spared. This is a good lad. We want him on active service. And so he gets sent out there. So the commanding officer's remark that was supposed to stop him from getting out there actually was the factor that got him out there.
And so, thanks to a little bit of old-fashioned patronage and a damn good bit of hustle, he finally makes his way to India. But there he learns a lesson in how not to do things.
Because the stories we hear from his experience, particularly from a logistical point of view, I suppose, rather than a military point of view, there are some confusing things. I mean, basically, they send them, the ship lands in Madras. It's redirected to Madras. Well, at this stage, there's no pier, there's no landing area. So they have to land straight on the beach with horses and with artillery. They're landing on the beach. I mean, it's ridiculous. There's no organization. They're pretty much having to do it themselves. They then spend 2 weeks getting acclimatized before they're given an order to go to Malakapatan. Now, I can't remember if that's the old name or the new name, so forgive me if I've used an old-fashioned name for it, which is where there is actually a place where they can go. When they get there in the evening. They're spending a long time there, waiting around on the beach. No one comes to see them. No one comes. No staff officer, nothing. And eventually a staff officer turns up and basically he's very angry and saying, what are you doing on the beach at this time of night? He said, well, we've been ordered to be here. And basically the order had supposed to have been countermanded, never was. And so they've gone all the way there. Well, all their baggage has already boarded ship. So they're stuck there on the beach without any spare clothing, baggage, toiletries, anything like that. And it's an absolute mess and chaos. Then when finally they do get sent forward and they go forward into action, they're landed without any headgear. All they've got is forage caps. Well, if you know a forage cap, it gives you precious little protection from the sun. So they've got no helmets, and they're advancing in the heat of India without any head protection. And unsurprisingly, many of the men go down with, well, sunstroke, solar apoplexy, I think they call it at the time. And, you know, they're decimated because of this. And so this whole campaign, I mean, he does see active service. He does command men in battle for the first time as a young man. And I suppose in a sense, well, it could be misconstrued, but he gets that out of the way. You know, he needs that first time in battle is all, particularly as an officer, I think, but for anyone, is always a trying experience, because I suppose you can have all the training in the world, but if you're a young officer, you don't know how you're going to, or any soldiers, you don't know how you're going to react in combat until you're actually there. And he comes through that experience, and I think he gains a lot of valuable lessons. He's with G Battery of the 14th Brigade of the Royal Artillery, and I'm going to massacre this name, I do apologise, Nabuda, I think it is, Field Force under Major General George Whitlock. And they see a fair bit of fighting. I mean, they're at Banda, where the artillery actually plays quite an important part, and he goes all the way through. So this is the Central India campaign, really, with Whitlock's column. And so he sees quite a lot of active fighting. I mean, being an artillery officer, he's a little bit withdrawn. You know, he's not on the battle line, but yeah, he comes under fire himself. He sees a lot of action. He learns to fight when someone's firing back at you. You know, which no training in the world really can get you ready for that. And then obviously he serves there for a little over a year, and then he's invalided home. I've never been able to find out exactly why. There's a story that he fell from his horse and damaged his leg, but I think that is getting misconstrued with another event later in his life in India, when he fell from a horse and damaged his leg. I don't think he did it twice. I've got a feeling he probably succumbed to sunstroke.
So shortly after returning home, he got promoted to captain and got a nice job as an instructor at Woolwich Military Academy, the place where he had been and where they train engineering and artillery officers. It's worth pointing out here that young Brackenbury did have one very strange quirk. Let's find out more.
Brackenbury, actually, to make him seem, partly I think to make him seem like he was higher born than he was, and also I believe as a defence mechanism against the fact that he was a very professional individual in an era when that wasn't looked upon very kindly, he affected a lisp. And so he would, you know, the sort of the haw-haw laugh that we see in as a caricature, he sort of affected that and a lisp. And so his name, Brackenbury, would be pronounced Brackenbury. You know, and
why? One has to ask the question
because
why.
it was fashionable, because it was very fashionable. There were a lot of these lisping dandies around the British Army at that period.
And so the lisping hero of our story finds himself as the first ever professor of military history at Woolwich. He begins writing journal articles and even writing for the popular press. He really starts to make a name for himself.
Because of the nature of the journals and newspapers he's writing for, he's getting noticed by politicians. He's getting noticed by the campaigners, perhaps more than if he'd written for, you know, the trade journals. And I say that in the sense that a politician probably read Blackwood's magazine, but didn't read the Royal United Service Journal. So we really do have a sense where he's reaching people that he perhaps wouldn't otherwise reach. But it is also appreciated by the military, and that's how he really comes to the attention of Garnet Wolseley. Their first meeting, although it's very brief, is actually related to a journal that they're both going to write articles for.
So Garnet Wolseley is a big player during that late Victorian era. If you were in with him, you had a good chance of a successful career. He had a group of people around him known as the Wolseley Ring, and he helped to push their careers forward.
And so basically, whenever there's a campaign or there's a likelihood of war, Wolseley's the man who's being earmarked to take it. And Wolseley builds up around him this group of young, to a large extent, quite intellectual officers. And they sort of become his private general staff. One important thing to remember is at this period in time, there is no general staff of the British Army. There's a staff college, and it's training staff officers, but there's no general staff for them to naturally go into.
So with influential friends and his trusty lisp standing him in good stead, he finds himself at the heart of the Franco-Prussian War, during which he managed to win both the Legion d'Honneur and the Iron Cross. Let's find out how he did this probably unique feat.
He actually sees more of the Franco-Prussian War than I think any British person does. This starts off initially as one of his in between term lecture tours, and he's basically gone off to view the battlefields. Whilst he's going there, the Franco-Prussian War breaks out. He actually breaks the rules a little bit because he has permission to go out there already existing. And just before he leaves, an order is given that no British officer is to travel to the continent, because they don't want any British officers getting involved in the Franco-Prussian War and causing a diplomatic incident. And his own brother, again, has been refused permission to travel as a war journalist, because he'd wrote quite a bit for the Times. And so Brackenbury, he's got his permission, he's quite within his rights, but he leaves immediately. He gives no forwarding address. He just gets out of the country, gets there, and knows that if they try and recall him, it's going to take a long time. And he's got a reasonably strong position because he can say, well, I've got my permission here. Excuse me. I didn't know that, it had been overturned or that this order affected me because I've already got my permission. And so he goes out there. He sees the early stages of the Franco-Prussian War. And then he returns home and he writes a number of articles about what he's seen. And some of it in particular touches on the way the wounded are being treated and the lack of facilities, because obviously this conflict's gone in a direction that, well, I think people did see, but perhaps didn't appreciate. We've got mass killing. It's total war because we've got modern rifles, we've got modern breech loading, well, sometimes breech loading, but even muzzle loading rifled artillery. This is doing a lot of damage. And Brackenbury had previously written about, he'd been to the Paris exhibition and he'd written about ambulances and hospital care and sort of tried to highlight that the British Army had nothing like this, and why haven't we? And so these articles bring him to the attention of a number of people, particularly Lord Wantage. And Lord Wantage, who's a former, is actually a friend of, well, colleague, former British Army officer who made a very successful marriage and became an incredibly wealthy man and a politician.
The best type of marriage. If only I'd been that wise.
Well, there's a saying in the Brackenbury family, which exists this day, which one of the current members told me, that the Brackenburys are as rich as their wives' money. So Brackenbury appreciated that. But Wantage actually sets up something called the National Aid Society. This is a forerunner in many ways of the British Red Cross. And this is a society that is going to provide services to the sick and wounded of all the combatant powers of the Franco-Prussian War. It's very much a neutral society. They're not trying to favour one side over another. And Brackenbury later has to deal with accusations of breaches of neutrality and tries to ensure that they are maintaining neutrality. And so he's actually asked to go out. He joins the committee of the National Aid Society, and then they ask him to go out there because they want a military man. They want someone who knows a battlefield to go out there and run the National Aid Society at the seat of war. He's ideal as well because not only has he been there already, he knows the battlefield, he has reasonable skill with languages, he's got a first-rate logistical mind. And so he goes out there basically and he runs the National Aid Society at the seat of war, and they provide, relief to the suffering on all sides, and they're greatly appreciated by all sides as well. Brackenbury has to fight to maintain his neutrality because at various periods, the Germans say, well, we'd like to take over running your enterprise, and the French say the same, and he has to say, no, we have to remain neutral. But actually, at one point, it goes the other way, and the Germans actually say to them, if we give you the supplies, can you get it out to the men? And Brackenbury actually has to say to them, well, yes, but if there's French wounded there as well, we'll give it to the French as well as the German. You have to understand that whatever we're giving out, we're going to give out to whoever's there, the sick and wounded. And the Germans go along with this, quite surprisingly. So Brackenbury actually does a wonderful job there. And at the end of the campaign, he's honoured with both the Iron Cross by the Germans. There's various. Technically, I think that's given by the Prussians because we're in this stage when.
Yeah, good point.
Because he gets a Bavarian honour as well, because obviously they're one of the combatant powers, and he gets the French Legion d'Honour. And as I say, as far as I'm aware, I have never found another case or can find any evidence that anyone else received both awards. Because normally they're diametrically opposed, aren't they? If you're getting one, you're not getting the other. And actually,
that would lead to some questions when you have your medals out, wouldn't it? That'd be a good conversation starter.
There's the thing. There's actually, it's a long story, and I won't go into it. But he's originally he thinks he's going to miss out on the 2 awards because the Germans have said, well, we're only going to give it to you if you're actually going to be allowed to wear it. And Queen Victoria had a great dislike of her officers wearing foreign medals, and actually he was refused permission. There's questions in the House of Commons and the House of Lords. There's a whole debate about this thing, and they're given permission to wear it, but not on military uniform. So Brackenbury still wears it, but he doesn't wear it on his Royal Artillery uniform.
In 1873, Brackenbury receives a letter from his new best mate Wolseley inviting him to become his military general secretary for the upcoming campaign in Asante in West Africa. It was an important role for Brackenbury.
One of the interesting things that Brackenbury does as they're sailing out to Ashanti land is he gives a series of lectures about the Ashanti and the Fanti and that whole area. Which is, quite an interesting thing because I don't think that happened before on many campaigns that they spend the journey out there preparing for it. He does a brilliant job as military secretary. There's this element where Brackenbury wants to prove himself as a soldier, so he does actually take part in one of the attacks as well, leading from the front. And he comes out of that with great distinction. And it's the start of making him. I suppose there's one little thing that needs to be said here, how important military service in the field was for career advancement. In the first 17 years of his service, Brackenbury's promoted once from lieutenant to captain. In the next 15 years, after his meeting with Wolseley, he goes from captain to lieutenant general. That's quite a jump.
Helps to have friends in high places, right?
There's an element of that. Wolseley is helping, but there are actually also times when Wolseley isn't helping. Wolseley's actually stops a couple of his promotions, and it's the active service that's helping as well. Whether you like it or not, career advancement, particularly in this era, comes on the battlefield. It does. Yes, particularly we're getting rid of the period of purchase, and Brackenbury's not involved by purchasing of commissions anyway because he's an artillery officer and they didn't have purchase. So you've got seniority, and it can take an awful long time in the Royal Artillery to get your next rank if it's just by seniority, because you have to wait for someone to either sell out or die. After Ashantiland, he sees service with Wolseley in Natal, where Wolseley's been sent as governor. Natal, so shortly after Natal It's a bit confusing, but basically Natal becomes part of British possessions in South Africa, having been semi-independent, or well, independent, I suppose. And there's a bit of trouble there, and so they send a military man to sort of run the country and try and bring things under control. Really, there's not a lot going on. Brackenbury seems to spend most of his time running the paper, the Times of Natal. He basically runs the paper for a year or so, and engages in an extramarital affair, which becomes quite notable with one of the Shepstons, which I think well-known family of that era in South Africa.
Very much so, yeah.
It's Offie Shepston's wife. He's carrying on with.
Wow, and was this common knowledge at the time? Did it have any repercussions for him?
It didn't, but Wolseley was certainly fully aware of it, and he actually, because if you know anything about the Wolseley correspondence with his wife, she is an incurable gossip, and Garnet Wolseley indulges her in this by providing her with all the latest gossip.
Brilliant.
And so he's telling her all about Brackenbury. So we actually know a bit of what's going on. And Brackenbury says that, Offie Shepton's wife is a most delightful woman, etc. Sort of says doesn't say I can understand it, but he sort of says he can see the attraction, sort of thing, without saying that. And then he also says a wonderful line about, whilst I can't condone it, having met Mrs. Brackenbury, I can understand it. Which, not a very nice thing to say, but his first wife was quite a difficult woman. Some of her correspondence with Henry just descends into rants that have no bearing on what the letter was about in the first place. And Brackenbury's not guilt-free there. I mean, he has been engaging in extramarital affairs. The Shepston one, and the lady Edith de Sanchez, who becomes his second wife later on after the death of his first wife. They're the only two I can prove. There's another one I highly suspect, and it is mentioned in the book, but I actually have it's circumstantial evidence and a bit of gossip going around.
You really wouldn't think this guy was a shagger, would you? Well, they always do say it's the ones you least expect. So anyway, his career picks up. It's very busy now. I'm going to go through it quickly. After Natal, he does a stint in Cyprus, reorganising the police, amongst other things. He then returns to South Africa alongside Wolseley once more, just in time to see the end of the Anglo-Zulu War. He packs his bags from there and goes to India. That short posting is followed by a spell as the military attaché in Paris. He's then sent to Ireland to deal with Fenian terrorists, but he gets bored of that and resigns. The government, annoyed at this, said his career was over, but he kept chipping away. The powers that be finally relented, and he's put in command of the artillery in Gibraltar. Then, finally, after being out of the limelight for so long, he returns to action to take part in the Gordon Relief Expedition in Sudan.
It's a bit of a disappointing campaign in many respects. Wolseley, obviously with memories of his great triumph in the Red River expedition, decides to try and send everything down the Nile. It makes sense to an extent, because obviously we haven't got the big railways here. I mean, that was what Kitchener did to reconquest of the Sudan, was he built the railway. He extended the railway to give them that extra advantage. So they start trying to sail everything down the Nile. It's a laborious process. It's very difficult. Brackenbury's part of the river column that is doing this, and is moving down there. He's the second in command to General Earl. So he's second in command and chief of staff, which is an ideal appointment for Brackenbury. They then decide, because there's a need to get there quicker, they send the desert column off trying to go across the desert to reach there, whilst the river column tries to carry on down the river, and it's sort of snaking round going the river, whereas the desert column tries to go in a straight line. Desert column meets a lot of resistance. River column doesn't meet a huge amount, but it's just so slow. Then at Kirbekan, which is quite a successful little battle, which Brackenbury plays an important part on, although General Earl deserves a lot of credit for that. But General Earl is killed just after it. It's sort of like as they're mopping up the operation. And Brackenbury assumes command of the river column. Now we get this interesting bit where he does continue the movement down the river, but sometimes I think there have been some historians who rather confuse what Brackenbury's doing with what Wilson's doing. And as we know, Wilson is the man who's often blamed for being too late because he arrives there, just after Gordon's been killed. Well,
and Wilson was commanding the desert column. Is that right?
Yes. He was, but then he did end up actually coming down on a steamer, I think, in the end, didn't he? But yes, he did. The desert column does devolve upon him.
Fascinating campaign, which I hope to do more on in the future, definitely.
Yeah, and Brackenbury gets blamed, but there is actually some people who say that Brackenbury took the controversial decision to withdraw. Well, I can tell you for a fact it was an order from Wolseley, because I've seen the order and it exists in the National Archives if anyone wants to go and fish it out. Brackenbury is ordered to withdraw. Part of the reason for that is that Buller, who eventually ends up commanding the desert column, has got that far and realizes my column's in a bit of a state. What's the point of going forward? Khartoum's already in the hands of the Mahdiist forces. Gordon's dead. What am I going to do? And he decides to withdraw to regroup. Well, at that point, Brackenbury's got no choice anyway, even if it wasn't a direct order. Once Buller decides to withdraw, Brackenbury's in no state to advance and try and take Khartoum. But again, that's not really what the orders were. The orders were to relieve General Gordon. Well, General Gordon's dead. And just to note that, General Gordon is dead before Brackenbury ends up taking command of the column. So to blame him in any way or form for Gordon's death is a bit ridiculous. Yeah, I mean, the Sudan campaign for Brackenbury is an important event because after this, he achieves general rank. He becomes a major general, and he's on to a new level of importance. And there's three key appointments that follow this: head of the intelligence branch, military member of the Council of the Viceroy of India, which might not sound like much, but is actually an incredibly important position, and then Director General of the Ordnance during the South African War. And so this is what now Brackenbury's reached a point where he's really able to show his skill, to show his talents. He's got big departments to try and reorganize, and he becomes something of a troubleshooter. He's sent into departments that are failing, that are in great difficulty, to completely rejuvenate them and bring them around.
Two of those jobs I think are really interesting. Let's start with the first one as head of the military intelligence branch.
The intelligence branch has actually had a lot of success and has grown, but it's fallen away in its prestige. It's not been taken seriously. A lot of the officers are elsewhere doing other jobs, and this was the problem. One of the things that Brackenbury changed immediately, a lot of the officers in the intelligence branch were attached officers, so they had to perform other duties as well. And of course, because they were regimental officers, still formally on the strength of the regiment, if the regiment got posted somewhere, they were gone. And suddenly there was a gaping hole. Brackenbury reduces the number of attached officers to the department. He also completely rejuvenates it. And the intelligence branch of this period is a magnificent thing. Anyone wants to know any more about it, and there are some excellent books on it. Thomas G. Ferguson's British Military Intelligence, but also, William, let me see if I can find it. Under Every Leaf by William Beaver.
Under Every Leaf, William Beaver. Okay.
That is a magnificent book on the history of the intelligence branch, and basically shows how it was rejuvenated under Brackenbury. We're looking at a period here where it goes from being a backwater to almost being a general staff in all but name.
So the military intelligence branch, sorry to cut you off, Chris, just because I'm not sure. The military intelligence branch at the time Would that be like the modern day intelligence corps, like sort of analysis of like, you know, the enemy and all of that? Or was it more like the modern MI6? Like, where did it sit? What was its role?
It's a bit of everything, actually. It's a bit of everything. I mean, we're not talking necessarily about field intelligence, so that's separate. We're not talking about officers, intelligence officers who accompany expeditions, military expeditions. We're talking about War Office intelligence. So there's a bit of what would become MI6. There's a bit of more so your intelligence corps as it is today, or you know, military defense intelligence. It's very interesting because, as I say, it's a department that's virtually ceased to exist. Brackenbury quickly turns it into a very dynamic department, and they built up this magnificent War Office library, intelligence library. And Brackenbury had a very simple way of operating intelligence. And he basically called it constantly sucking in information. So constantly be bringing in information. And then the clever part was to collate it, to put it into reports, into files. And they had this magnificent library, which was the envy of the world, actually, at one point. The Germans, you know, this great German intelligence staff that we hear so much about, they think the War Office intelligence is magnificent. They are absolutely amazed that here is a department that is half the size and half the budget. Well, no, not even that. Quarter the size, quarter the budget of what they've got. And they're producing this excellent intelligence. And he builds up this great department. And a lot of it, we talk intelligence and people think spying. There's an element of that, but it's actually very small. A lot of it is information that's in the public domain. So journal articles, foreign newspaper cuttings, things like that. Also trade reports. You know, such and such a company has sold this to the German army or to the French army, which on its own is fairly insignificant. But you put it all together and you get some very accurate reports. Yeah, yes, there's the military attaché reports as well, but again, they're less significant than the stuff that's coming just from the public domain. And every now and again, Brackenbury does send in a spy, in inverted commas, and basically he sets up a procedure for doing this, which is whereby officers on leave will travel to an area and just take little notes as they're going there. And one of the famous ones is Baden-Powell, who does a lot of interesting spy work. And one of the notable things is where he goes to French North Africa and takes draws a picture of various coastal scenes, etc. And in an intricate sort of system of dots and dashes, he estimates the caliber of guns and how many of them are, where they're positioned. And it's just, if you just look at it, it's an ordinary watercolor, but there's something hidden inside it.
And so, after reforming and improving the military intelligence branch, Brackenbury takes on a new job. This time, he's making sure Britain has enough munitions. Ish, I'm getting old. Munitions for the Second Anglo-Boer War.
In South Africa itself, the South African War, his work as Director General of the Ordnance is just magnificent. You see Brackenbury at his best here. He's using his skill, his knowledge, but he's also bending the rules wherever he can. And Lansdowne's allowing him to bend the rules. Technically, just as a quick example, technically, as Director General of the Ordnance, before he buys anything or before he orders anything or construction or anything, he's supposed to send all the papers in to the Financial Secretary of the War Office for approval. He basically says, look, we've got a war going on here. I can't be doing this all the time. And Lansdowne manages to give him permission from the cabinet that anything urgent he can just do off his own bat and then send in the paperwork later. Well, Brackenbury bends this a little bit and decides that anything connected with the war whatsoever is classed as urgent. And so basically it's just commissioning stuff off his own bat and sending it out there to meet the emergencies at the time. And without him, the army would have run out of ammunition. He manages to borrow stuff from all over the empire. There's a huge shortage of such stuff like cordite, for example. So at one point he has to send out a load of artillery shells just filled with gunpowder because there's no cordite. And this is where he manages to get around some of the War Office way of doing things. For example, they only use 3 companies for the supply of cordite. There's 20 in the country that can produce it, but they only use these 3. And Brackenbury says, well, why on earth are we doing that? If we've got 20 companies that can produce it, we've got a huge demand for it. Let's go to them. And eventually they do. And there's all sorts of things like this with ammunition as well. You probably know there's a famous story about Sir George White when he's commander in South Africa at the start of the Boer War. He sends in a demand to the War Office for 4 million rounds of ammunition. Well, he gets a message back saying, I think there's an error in your messaging. You surely don't mean 4 million rounds. Well, yes, he did. And things like that demand was the monthly supply. I think they were looking for, at the height of it, they were looking for 3.5 million rounds a month for South Africa during the war. Well, British industry can only produce 1.5 million rounds. So there's a major shortfall there. And Brackenbury basically gets the ordnance factories working on this full time. And between them, they just about cover it. But the ordnance factories, and here, just needs to be explained, Brackenbury makes a condition of taking on the job that the ordnance factories are under his control as Director General of the Ordnance. It's a darn good job he did that. He wouldn't have known that the war was coming. Well, perhaps he would have suspected, but he wouldn't have known the demands of it. Having the ordnance factories there allow him to meet these demands for ammunition. He would not have been able to do it without the ordnance factories. And the problem is the War Office has this belief in the power of British industry. And they've allowed the ordnance factories and the government's own manufacturing side to come into disrepair, basically because there's a belief that whatever we need in an emergency, British industry will supply. Well, the South African War blows that theory out of the water because British industry is just not able to keep up. And in absolute fairness to them, we're talking about commercial concerns. There's an area where there's a firm, Kinnock's, who are producing ammunition, and they've got an order for the American army. They consider that more important than suddenly having to produce ammunition for the British Army. We've got this order, we've got to fulfill it, and we've got to meet it. Perfectly understandable, because they're a commercial concern. They've been paid for this. They can't suddenly say, oh, sorry, we can't do that anymore. We've got to do this. I mean, unless it, First World War, obviously it becomes different. It's a national emergency, etc., etc. But unless you declare the South African War a national emergency and start saying to firms, the government needs to say to firms, you've got to forget foreign orders, we need to concentrate on the British. Commercial concerns are always going to be the heart of a commercial company. And this is where you needed the ordnance factories. And it was so vital that Brackenbury had been able to get them working and get them doing the job properly. And this is why someone like, the future King Edward says he pulled the army out of the hole. Because if he hadn't done things like this, South African War would have been very, very different. They would have run out of ammunition, most certainly.
And so in 1904, tired and sick, having worked so hard for so many years, Brackenbury finally retired. He died in 1914, but at least managed to spend a few years with the love of his life, his second wife. It's fair to say that he was one of the most important and influential generals of the era, but one often overlooked and forgotten, until now. Thanks to Chris Brice for filling us in. That was a big gap in my knowledge. I'd barely heard of the guy. So I'll be back next week. Same time, same place. Friday, 6 o'clock. That's my new slot. Seems to be working. Let's hope it stays that way. In next week's video, it's a really good one actually. I'll be walking around Lucknow Residency, doing a sort of then and now comparison and telling the story of that desperate, deadly siege of 1857.